October brings autumnal colours, cosy evenings in front of the fire, and of course, Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. And that means sweets, or candy if you're American, but more importantly, it means horror films. Some crazy people on Twitter and YouTube have named this month Spooktober or Shocktober, or other such tenuous puns, which pretty much means watching a horror movie every day during the month. For my attempt at this so-called 31 days of horror, I decided that instead of watching any old horror from my Letterboxd Watchlist, I would compile a separate list of underseen, less well-known horror films, which had to loosely conform to these 3 rules. 1. I must not have already seen the film. 2. Each film must have a minimum average Letterboxd rating of 3.0. And 3. The film cannot have been watched by more than 10 of my Letterboxd friends. The final list contains over 120 films, so please feel free to take a look yourselves, the link is in the description below, and why not follow me on Letterboxd as you're already there. And I did throw in a couple of films too this month which aren't on the list, just because I wanted to watch them, and I enjoy chaos. So many horror reviews incoming for you to boost your own Letterboxd horror watch lists. In order, I started the month with a very random choice. The Day of the Beast, a very silly Euro farce comedy horror caper from 1995.
¿Podremos soportar esta cruz? Sí.
This has a great premise of a Roman Catholic priest committing as many sins as possible before the reincarnation of the Antichrist. It doesn't quite find the promise of that premise, but this is a fun, energetic caper that mostly entertained me. It's also very 90s with some garish and dated PlayStation level CGI. It's just about worth a watch if you're into those Euro curios, but not one I'd rush to see again. For film number 2, I came away from the underseen less well known and went for a British television classic, Ghostwatch. For those who don't know, Ghostwatch is an infamous mockumentary which first aired on the BBC on Halloween in 1992. It featured famous TV presenters from the day and was presented as a reality news documentary, and if you didn't know any better, and many people didn't at the time, it looked like a live report on an actual poltergeist haunting. And whether you knew or not, it was truly shit your pants scary. As a 15-year-old, it was monumental TV. It was always spoke about at school for the following couple of days. We were old enough to know that it wasn't real, and the BBC were pretty open about that, but even though it wasn't intended to dupe anyone, it was still pretty damn terrifying. And now, 31 years later, even though it's aged pretty badly and you can see through it all very easily, I have to admit getting goosebumps at the "what big eyes you have" moment. On a critical level, it's not really very good. The acting, particularly from the main family, is not even up to Casualty level. Amazingly, the BBC presenters are excellent, especially Michael Parkinson.
With Michael Parkinson.
It's just a shame the BBC will never do something this brave again. Next up, I watched Bloody Hell from 2020, and this is a solid effort. Surprisingly well shot and snappily edited for a pretty low budget horror. Ben O'Toole is also really strong as anti-hero Rex. Think of the charisma and likability of Ryan Reynolds with the sharp tongue of Robert Downey Jr., mixed with the snide theatrics of Christian Slater, and you're pretty much there. The setup is also a strong point, giving the main character plenty of depth and purpose and a situation full of potential. Unfortunately, and I do wonder how much of this is down to budget, the final third takes way too long to fully pull the trigger and get to the carnage you know is coming. It's also a little tame considering the build-up. It definitely needed a little more madness in that payoff, but overall this was decent and good fun. Isolation next from 2005. This is Alien meets The Thing on an Irish farm, and it's grim, icky and hugely bleak. A miserable creature feature which takes a long time to build the dread and sense of filthy unease. As a pure creature feature, it's mildly successful, often held back by its budget, and a creature that you never really get to see or get a true feeling of what it's capable of. The cast is great. Sean Harris, Ruth Negga, Essie Davis and John Lynch each throw themselves into their roles, each of which must have required several showers a day. This is a mud, blood, guts and gore soaked ick fest, and they all definitely earn their paychecks. I think I prefer the long build up to the actual creature stuff in general, and I definitely felt the need for something light afterwards, but if you're after a very grimy and grim horror, I reckon you'll dig Isolation. Into the 70s next with Messiah of Evil from 1973. And this one certainly has an interesting vibe. It's oppressive and creepy and you're constantly asking, what the fuck is happening here? After a while though, its sludgy pacing and aimless story left me unengaged. It does have some cool moments, a particularly good one in the cinema, but it's filled with hammy theatre acting, abysmal editing and exceptionally poor makeup effects. Not for me this one. To South Korea next with Bedevilled from 2010, and this one was a bit of a letdown. If you're going to build a litany of mental, physical and sexual abuse about a character, then perhaps A, don't do it through weird melodrama, and B, Don't do it to a side character. Honestly, this film is a bit of a mess. You have an apparent main character who we follow very slowly from the start, who switches to a background character halfway, only to come back into the fray tenuously towards the end. The twisted patriarchy that governs the island where the film is set is honestly just too preposterous to ever fully believe. All the antagonists are just too much. If they're not raping or beating the female characters, they're excusing the behaviour. And maybe these backwater communities exist, but I never found it remotely believable. Thankfully their comeuppance is mostly very satisfying, with tons of gnarly gore in the last part, but by then, after what it felt like 3 hours, the film had lost me. Heading away from the Underseen list to a film I've been meaning to get round to for a very long time, William Peter Blatty's Exorcist 3. And it absolutely did not disappoint. This is excellent. At its best when it's just George C. Scott, Brad Dourif and Jason Miller in that cell talking. Miller, who I've always felt was the weakest of a great bunch of actors in the original movie, is absolutely sensational here. It's like two completely different actors, but as the first film was his first role, it kind of makes sense. But Miller, alongside the also excellent Scott, is acted off the park by Brad Dourif in an absolutely mesmerising performance. Give this man some decent dialogue and he will steal every scene.
The Gemini is dead.
No, I am not! I'm alive!
Outside the acting, the film in general is quite messy. It's clearly a few different films pulling in different directions, but somehow that helps to create something odd and unique and a completely different film to that original. Of course, there's also that fantastic long build jump scare, the ceiling granny, and other such iconic moments which will keep the film in my head for some time. The final 15 minutes goes hard, but definitely veers full on into silly territory, but it doesn't spoil what came before, and I just wish I'd seen this one sooner. A hidden gem up next from 2015. I like this in spite of its many flaws, plot holes, and precocious child acting. It's another end of the world virus zombie style movie where a family is safely enclosed from some kind of outside threat. This is the first and only film so far from the Duffer Brothers. As they've shown the world via Stranger Things, they know how to direct polished, creepy horror light and how to build interesting horror fantasy worlds. I'm not sure they've quite shown us yet that they're good writers, and this film is no different. It hugely benefits from having Alexander Skarsgård and Andrea Riseborough as the leads, and they both did good work as desperate parents trying to keep their only child safe from the external threat. It goes somewhere I didn't expect, and I'm always a sucker for these movie situations, so I'm going to give this a it's probably not really quite worth it 6 out of 10. To the 80s for film number 9 with Dead and Buried from 1981. An odd one, but generally pretty likeable. Its creepy weirdness is intriguing in the first half, and I wish it had cracked up this carnival eerie vibe rather than going for a more rounded narrative, which felt very Twilight Zone light by the end. It feels a little like a weak John Carpenter film, but even Carpenter's weaker films have a hokey likability about them, and Dead and Buried is the same. It's definitely worth a go purely down to it being so kooky, and in spite of some garish technical aspects, horrid overexposed lighting, distracting ADR, this was a relatively fun watch. The Battery from 2012 is a decent stab at something different in the zombie genre. This is a zombie buddy road movie drama which focuses on the buddy drama. It's light and gentle, going for the opposite of bombastic, which you don't often see in zombie movies. It suffers the same issues as many super low budget horrors, namely an overuse of montage and scene shots that are 2 to 3 times longer than they need to be. However, writer-director, lead actor Jeremy Gardner knows how to keep the story within its meagre means, and The Battery is pretty successful considering its apparent and insanely impressive $6,000 budget. If you're new to the channel and you've added one of these films to your Letterboxd watchlist, perhaps you can let me know by gently clicking on the subscribe button. Back to the 80s next for The Hidden from 1987.
We talking spacemen here?
Something gets in his way, he kills us.
This is a full-on, balls-to-the-wall, buddy cop 80s sci-fi action extravaganza. It starts in 5th gear and barely lets up through a full suite of 80s sci-fi action cliches, and it's gloriously entertaining. I hadn't even heard of this one till recently, which is a shock because I know I would have absolutely lapped this up when it was released in the late 80s. It does begin to run out of fuel for the last 15 minutes, but if you want an 80s action sci-fi cheese fest in the mould of Runaway or Trancers, The Hidden has ladles full of the right stuff. Recent found footage next with Incantation from just last year. Now this suffers from all the stereotypical issues seen in almost every found footage film ever, plus it's a bit of a narrative editing pacing mess, but in spite of this big pile of problems, I had a good time with Incantation. I was surprised not only with how many creepy effective horror moments we get, but also with the heart of the film which comes via the mother-daughter bond of the main characters. And once again I am in absolute awe at another very young Asian actor. I don't know if different methods are used in this continent, but it's staggering to me to see the success rate of child actors in Korean, Taiwanese, Japanese, Indonesian horror films, especially compared to similar ages and roles in the UK and US. The cast all round is great too, which draws you into the story, jumbled as it is, and this helps sell all the scares. I honestly didn't have great expectations for this one because of general found footage hit rates, but Incantation was a nice surprise. And perhaps you'll get a nice surprise if you hit that like button, or perhaps it'll just help this video out on YouTube. I suppose you won't know until you try. Good wholesome horror fun next with Villains from 2019.
But you know what I think the most telling thing about you is?
Come on, baby, there's nothing down here.
It's the little girl you got chained up in the basement.
The setup for this one is fairly predictable and seen it before, but Villains shines through its adherence to the cause of fun and through the 4 hugely likeable performances. I do like that Micah Monroe, Bill Skarsgård, Kyra Sedgwick and Jeffrey Donovan are each going for something slightly different, and it makes a difference that they're all given equal weight and billing in the story. It probably is just a little too light for its own good, and I don't think it'll stay in my memory for too long, but this was 90 minutes which flew by and it had me on board for the whole ride. Right back to the 60s next for a horror starring Audrey Hepburn of all people.
She is blind, and she is alone. The terrible suspicion growing.
Wait Until Dark is a very, very convoluted suspense thriller from 1967, which completely collapses when you stop to consider the massive logic leaps and plot holes. There are also some big clashes of acting styles. Hepburn is going with wild OTT melodrama that was thankfully becoming unfashionable by the late 60s. Alan Arkin is somehow playing a role from the late 70s thriller, completely out of place and ahead of its time in this setting. Richard Crenna and Jack Weston thankfully are the underacting glue holding everything together. But it's difficult to immerse yourself in a story when at every decisive moment you're questioning why a character did something, why they didn't do something, and honestly every major moment of the film is undermined by the flimsiest of logic. I was really looking forward to this one, but it was some weak sauce. To Australia next on my next 2 films, starting with Hounds of Love from 2016. This is a slow-moving, very realistic, voyeuristic, kidnap, torture horror. It shows virtually nothing, but it takes a long time doing it, almost like a sick tease, and it often makes you feel icky with how much it meanders on the horror of the situation. It also has a lot to say on sexual and domestic violence and mental and physical abuse, both from the 2 antagonists towards the protagonist, but also between the couple of antagonists, with the man being a controlling, violent, toxic gaslighter. There were moments in the midpoint where it almost lost me, but it came back strong and ended well. Not one I'll watch again, but a very solid effort. Into the Outback for Aussie film number 2 with Wake in Fright from 1971. A unique film which I don't quite know how to unravel. It's an oppressive, nihilistic fever dream fueled by booze and the madness of the Australian outback. There are some genuinely unpleasant animal hunting scenes which I really struggled to get through. The lead actor is also pretty awful, but his stiffness does feed into the character, an arrogant, lost fish out of water. It's another I doubt I'll ever watch again, and I can't say I enjoyed it, but it did get its hooks into me and my opinion of it is likely to grow over time. Hagazussa from 2017 is a glacier slow, moody, atmospheric folk horror dirge. People have compared this to The Witch, but even that film with its light, unconventional plotting is 10 times more eventful than Hagazussa. Not that this is necessarily a criticism. I think I liked it. On another night, I might have hated it. Either way, it's not one to easily recommend, not one I'd watch again, but if you like your horror very slow and full of dread and atmosphere and little else, this is definitely worth a try. Now I know I said I watched 31 horrors for this video, but that's not strictly the case, as there were 2 picks which I just couldn't get through and had to turn off. The first being Castle Freak from 1995, though I still can't believe that date, as I honestly would have guessed 83, 84. This film is just absolutely dreadful. It's horrendously shot, the writing and plotting is childlike, and it's just a general piss poor production all round. I hardly ever turn off films, but I just could not get through this one. Following a film so bad I had to turn it off, to a film unfortunately not quite bad enough to turn off, but Slashback from 2022 is a dreadful film. The setting is beautiful, and that's really as far as I can go with the positives. The cast are uniformly terrible, everyone is stiff as a board, and this is exacerbated by some of the worst dialogue I've ever endured in a movie. I was hoping for some good teenage angst bants, but all the characters are irritating as hell, especially the lead who is a complete dick with no redeeming qualities. Weak character arcs are set up and forgotten, and the amazing setting is utterly wasted, which is easily the film's biggest crime. The creature design is fine and functional at a basic level, but it's also borrowed from other films and has no fresh or original ideas built upon it. One of the worst films I've seen for quite some time, and me and my 14-year-old daughter agreed, the absolute worst film we've ever watched together. Thankfully, Starry Eyes from 2014 was perfectly fine. Nearly a giallo, but not quite. Nearly a B-movie, but not quite. Starry Eyes is all about the toxicity of Hollywood, and in particular the auditioning and agent process. It's all very obvious what it's doing and where it's going, and it takes too long to get there, but thankfully when it arrives at Batshit Station, it really goes for it. There's some varying acting quality, and another of those obligatory 80s synth soundtracks bring it down a little bit, but generally a solid effort. Kidnapped is a 2010 Spanish home invasion horror. It's one of those rare films where I can't really criticise the film making or cast or editing etc, but I just did not like this one at all. A brutal and authentic home invasion horror which has a very tame and actually fairly dull first 45 minutes and then becomes jarringly violent and gory. It's a hugely triggering film too, especially if, like me, you can be a little sensitive to sound. There's a scene where a girl cries or whimpers, hyperventilates for a solid 20 minutes, where I eventually had to mute the audio. There are other more general triggering moments too. And it all feels bleakly pointless, not like in a similar film like Martyrs for example, where the violence is a huge part of the story. This is a horrid, nasty film and I would advise avoiding it, which I'm sure will make some of you want to watch it even more. Seconds, a sci-fi semi-horror from 1966, directed by John Frankenheimer, is a brilliantly shot and interesting film, and only really let down by a saggy and lacking second act.
I've been assigned to go over the circumstances of your death with...
Plot and theme-wise, I'd be very surprised if this didn't have strong influences on recent similar Twilight Zone-like sci-fis, such as Don't Worry Darling, Get Out, and perhaps even Fight Club. I'm not entirely sure if I've seen Rock Hudson in anything before, and he's fine here, though I wish his role had been taken by someone with a bit more acting chops, such as original choice Kirk Douglas. I love the fantastic super close-ups and claustrophobic shoulder-mounted shots. They really help sell the story, which begins with an absolute belter of an opening 30 minutes, closing with a great final 20, only dropping the ball a little in between. Mon 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 Monsters is a Taiwanese horror comedy from 2017. I feel I need to explain why I watched this one, because yes, it has a terrible name, and yes, it has a terrible poster, and yes, it looks like it's going to be shit, but with a good average review score on Letterboxd, remember the rules, and a solid rating on IMDb, and a slew of reviews claiming that the film is not what it first looks like, I took the risk. And you know what? It is every bit as bad as it looks. Seemingly written by a 10-year-old, every character is paper thin and exaggeratedly awful. The plot and pacing are all over the place, and we're not even treated to any particular interesting gore outside of blood spurting over windows and walls. The film doesn't even have the decency to reward your patience with a satisfying ending. What we get is honestly a mess, which left me pretty pissed off. If you take anything away from this video, it's don't watch Castle Freak and don't watch Mon 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 Monsters, because it's terrible. Of course it is, I mean, look at it. If you've heard of this next one, pat yourself on the back like you're hitting the subscribe button, because you are a true horror aficionado. Malefique is a French horror sci-fi from 2002, and it is a weird film. It's a very low budget horror which at first feels like Hellraiser, but directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet, and then it becomes many different disparate horror schlock comedy films all at once. It's relatively well shot with some playful camera work and some likeable characters, but it really is all over the place in terms of tone and pacing. It should either have gone fully batshit or more serious instead of the odd straddling of styles. You at least won't have seen another film like it, and there's a reason for that, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't mostly enjoy it. The Nightmare, a horror documentary from 2015, is sadly the second film in this list I had to turn off. But it wasn't because it's a terrible film like with Castle Freak. This is a documentary about sleep paralysis, which must be horrific for those who suffer with it, but this is essentially a 90-minute documentary of people explaining their dreams, and it's exactly as interesting and scary as it sounds. You know when people tell you about their dreams, or when people tell you they saw a ghost and you're just doing this face? That's the whole film, I'm guessing, because I didn't finish it. It's a shame because it's an interesting topic and idea for a documentary, but this doesn't really feel like a documentary rather than one-way interviews over and over again. Once again, veering away from the Underseen list to one of the most talked about and generally loved horror films from this year, Talk to Me. You know when you hear a heavy metal song which opens with a blistering, crunching riff that makes you bristle with excitement, and then that riff never quite comes back, instead only slightly less pulsating variations fill out the song? This is a thing, I promise. Well, that is taught to me. It's a brilliantly made film. You rarely see this level of craft in horror, great shot choice, dizzying editing, crisp sound design, excellent cast, good dialogue. The characters are all a little obnoxious, but that is by design, I feel. So I'm only feeling a little let down because that intense, frightening, brilliant opening 20 minutes front load the film and it never got close to it afterwards, though I certainly enjoyed the film as a whole. Rarely I'm actually excited for a sequel because I don't feel that they did all they could have done with the premise. Next, a film which may have been a relative unknown pre-release but has turned into the horror sleeper hit of the year, When Evil Lurks. This is proper horrifying horror. Just like with Damien Runger's previous film Terrified, the opening hour of When Evil Lurks is far stronger than the second. But unlike with Terrified, this one feels focused, well made, tightly written, and most significant, original and impactful. It's a bleak and incredibly brutal film, and it goes places where a lot of mainstream horrors wouldn't dare to go. There's one scene in particular which is strongly telegraphed, and I thought to myself, they wouldn't dare. And yet, they dared. The film is full of exposition and rules which at times does have a bit of a make it up as you go along vibe, but it does kind of work due to the nature of the horror and its very specific locality. Horrors like this do not come along often. From Argentina we go to Indonesia next for Impetigore from 2019. A solid effort and a better follow-up to Joko Anwar's Satan's Slaves, though it's becoming clearer to me that Anwar is an excellent director but a pretty so-so writer. Impetigore starts well with a striking opening scene followed by a strong setup. What follows, however, is soap opera horror light with expository scenes which vomit out the entire plot and mystery in one go, completely robbing the story of tension. It's a shame because it's a great looking film with some eerie cinematography, decent production design and well done minimal gore. The cast are all spot on too. If Anwar can nail a good story for his next film, we could be onto a winner. Another Spanish horror next with 2020's All the Moons. Tough to nail this one down, it's not really a horror, more a dark, sombre fairy tale. Hosea Caneros is a fantastic lead in her debut, and she fills the film with a warmth I wasn't expecting. The whole film is actually surprisingly warm and moving. It's also a vampire film which never comes close to using the V word and completely avoids any of the tropes of the genre. It's sparse and probably too slow moving for most horror fans, but it mostly worked for me. And we return to good old Blighty for the penultimate film, A Dark Song from 2016. This is a very grounded, very British horror drama that your modern jump scare crew will find way too boring. The two leads are solid and they effectively sell the down-to-earth dialogue. And this is a horror film without any flash or cheap tricks. It's a long, slow build which worked well for me, culminating in a payoff some viewers may find firstly not big enough and secondly a little silly. And whilst the end didn't blow me away, I wasn't expecting the horror to be suddenly ramped up to 11. I was honestly pleased when it got to an 8. I found it all pretty effective. Definitely could have done with a 10 to 15 minute trim, but this one surprised me. And I ended the month on a strong note with The Righteous from 2021.
Bring me my penance. How are you?
Is he okay? We don't even know this boy.
And sometimes you watch a film where you don't quite have a clear grasp on exactly what's happening, but you still manage to enjoy it. The Righteous is a simple film featuring only 3 characters of note, all played brilliantly. It looks great, crisply shot in black and white with some stark cinematography. The writing and dialogue are fantastic and I was completely absorbed by all the characters. My confusion comes from the antagonist who I can never work out. Who exactly is this person? Why are they acting this way? At one point he asks Henry Czerny's character to do something for him saying, "You know why." Well, I didn't know why and I still don't. Allegory and theology are at play here, so perhaps I'm lacking a bit of biblical knowledge. But all that aside, even feeling a bit dim by the end, I enjoyed this one. And that was my 31 days of horror. 31 films, almost all watched. To save my poor tortured mind, I'll be spending most of this month watching kitten videos. Thanks for watching.
Game over, man. It's game over.